Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we explore one of the most pervasive and yet mysterious phenomena in our world, and certainly in the human psyche, and that is the phenomenon of the shadow. We have a notion of evil in almost all cultures. And in the 20th century, Carl Jung, more than any other psychologist, popularized the additional notion of the shadow, which is intertwined with evil, but very separate from evil, and is a psychic phenomenon that, like our shadow, is hard to see because our shadow is always sort of behind us. And we consciously believe positive things about ourselves. And then all of a sudden we do something malevolent or something really stupid or something highly counterproductive when we wonder, how did we just do that? Well, we were in the grip of what Carl Jung would call the shadow. There are many archetypal formations, including the trickster, but we are confronted with shadow content almost everywhere we look in the world, from the escalating war in Ukraine and against China, the various personalities in politics. One thinks of Donald Trump and how he surfaced through his own personal shadow, the collective shadow of the United States. And that shadow now is moving dynamically in the American psyche. So shadow has both a personal, an institutional, and a collective encompassing all nations. And when the shadow grips a nation, like it did with Germany, in the 1930s, and now in the United States with Trump and the seizure of the psyche by the military-industrial complex and the march to war. These are shadow contents that require exquisitely sophisticated mechanisms of intelligence and emotional acuity to both discern and to creatively deal with. And today we're going to jump into one other aspect of the shadow, and that is the shadow on our spiritual path. We know that we need to become spiritual in order to deal with the shadow, but every step along the spiritual path, the shadow lurks. So we're going to look at the shadow today as best we can, knowing that most of us are so committed to the light that the shadow is very hard to see. Before we jump in to this very complex but hugely, urgently important exploration of the shadow with someone who has spent most of her life dealing with the shadow in a therapeutic way, let us just take a moment and let us just simply breathe together. In the midst of all the hustle and bustle, in the midst of all the grips of the shadows in all its multifarious ways, just simply breathing consciously and coherently gives us the inner coherence that we need to deal with the shadow contents of our psyche and soul. You're going to hear the sound of a bell. Let us just take 10 breaths together to the sounds of the bell. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. To help us explore shadow on the spiritual path, we're delighted to welcome back Connie Zweig, who's been on Humanity Rising a number of times before and convened various programs on the shadow and inner work of aging. She's a retired therapist. She is an author of a number of books, Meeting the Shadow, Romancing the Shadow, which I remember reading many years ago, and then recently wrote a book on the inner work of age, which won multiple awards, including the Gold Nautilus Award in 2022. And now she's written a book, her new book, on the shadow on the spiritual path, and how as we yearn and work for the light, the shadow doesn't go away, because the shadow is wherever the light is. So Connie, I really want to appreciate your ongoing support of Humanity Rising and the extraordinary programs that you have convened on our behalf, and welcome you now to tell us about your new book, Shadow on the Spiritual Path. And Connie's going to make a presentation, and then we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. And please feel free to put in the chat any questions or comments that you have had about this extraordinary subject. Connie?
Hi, Jim.
Hello.
That was such a great introduction. Thank you. That was wonderful. And thank you for having me back. And thank you, Georg, the wizard behind the curtain here. And thank you, Stan, for creating community for Humanity Rising. I try to watch every day, and I'm very, very much supportive of what's happening here and this contribution that you're making to the global audience. So as Jim said, I've spent a lot of my career studying and writing and working with people in shadow work. And I wanted to extend that work into the religious and spiritual arena. I couldn't find much material about this question. What is going on in the unconscious as we long for the divine, or for transcendence, or for non-duality, whatever we call it, whatever our language? What is happening in the shadow as we enter the spiritual path and travel alone or in community, find teachers, find practices? And so I want to spend a few minutes just presenting the basics of the new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening. And then we'll have a conversation, which I'm sure will be rich. So in every tradition, saints and poets speak about the soul's search for the beloved, the seeker's yearning for the divine, for the self beyond ego. And this holy longing is a secret feeling that we have with many disguises, leading us often to pursue a higher union in spiritual practice, a religious discipleship, even a romantic embrace. It guides us to timeless wisdom and transcendent experience. But it can also go awry when we project the divine onto a teacher, priest, guru, rabbi, roshi, who's all too human, who has unhealed wounds, undeveloped empathy, and maybe authoritarian tendencies. In effect, a woman or man who has a shadow. And if he or she abuses power, whether the abuse is sexual, financial, or emotional coercion, we feel a shock of betrayal, our innocence lost, and our faith shaken. We might say to ourselves, he can't be enlightened as he claimed, or she has secrets, she's not who I thought she was, or the priest lied and the congregation was duped. So in our time, we've witnessed many contemporary teachers of Buddhism, Hinduism, Hasidism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestant Christianity act out their shadows in destructive ways, leaving followers traumatized and lost. And some of us have experienced religious or spiritual abuse firsthand, and it's heartbreak and disillusionment. But we may not have had spiritual shadow work to help us rekindle the flame of longing in our souls. And some of us may have met our own shadows as teachers, and perhaps we were shocked at our own words or behaviors. So let's pause for a moment and reflect on what is the shadow, because I want to be sure we're all using the same understanding and frame of reference. There's some confusion about this in the popular vernacular. So as Jim mentioned, personal shadow is a term coined by the renowned Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung to refer to the personal unconscious. The shadow develops in each of us as children as we identify with socially acceptable traits, let's say politeness or generosity or caretaking, in order to find love and acceptance from adults. And in this way, we form a conscious ego and we banish the opposite traits, rudeness, stinginess, self-centeredness, into the unconscious shadow. So the ego and shadow develop in tandem. If our sadness is shamed, it's exiled into the shadow. If our anger is punished, it's banished too. If our musical or artistic talent is unacceptable, it gets buried in the shadow. And our egos develop to accommodate the loss of those authentic feelings and talents. And in the same way, in a spiritual community, if our anger or sadness is forbidden, we develop a spiritual persona to find belonging and acceptance. If the teacher forbids sex, those impulses are banished. We lose our connection to certain traits and feelings and attitudes that don't fit our communities or belief systems. And because the shadow is beneath the threshold of awareness, we can't gaze at it directly. It's like a blind spot in our field of vision. With shadow work, we can learn how to listen to the inner voices of the shadow that lead us to do the same things we've always done without the results we want. We begin to detect these voices as shadow characters and work with them in a specific way. So today we're going to share an introduction to the shadow on the spiritual path and the ways in which we meet the hidden, unacceptable, forbidden parts of ourselves and others in the spiritual arena. The shadow is like a dark room in which our feelings, dreams, and images lie dormant. And shadow work is like the process of development in which they come back to life. Daily accounts of the eruption of the human shadow bombard us today, as Jim mentioned, in the social and political arena. But there's been little exploration of it in the spiritual domain. We lived through a tidal wave of Catholic priest childhood sexual abuse scandals in the 1980s. And today, we observe social media and published reports of teachers in every denomination who claim the highest reaches of human consciousness, and yet who act out sexual assault, emotional abuse, and financial coercion, including Hindu swamis, Zen roshis, Tibetan lamas, Hasidic rabbis, Protestant clergy. And yet we continue to imagine a religious life without an encounter with human shadow. We continue to somehow believe that when we do our practice, everything will be sweetness and light. So why do we do this? Why do we continue to be shocked and betrayed when the shadow erupts? The Me Too movement went viral in 2017 to raise awareness of sexual violence in the workplace, military, universities, and other secular settings. It didn't publicly address abuse in the spiritual context, but the movement helped survivors and witnesses in spiritual communities to connect online, empower each other, and encourage whistleblowers. And some teachers could no longer control the narratives in their isolated kingdoms. Many fled the country or lost legal battles. In chapter 5 of the book, I tell the tales of many, many renowned teachers who fell from grace. When a group of Tibetan Buddhist survivors of abuse provided a document of allegations to the Dalai Lama, it was called Me Too Guru. It's evident from my research that we also need a spiritual justice movement, but only 13 states have penal statutes that support the criminal prosecution of clergy for sex with a congregant. So from childhood through late life, many people long for transcendence, for spirit, for a sense of the divine. When you imagine God, what do you see in your mind's eye? A stern, bearded male perched on a throne with angels circling his head? A beatific Madonna with an innocent child at her breast? Indra's net as it weaves through and interconnects all living things? The letters of a holy name? A colorful mandala? A sacred mountain? A vast sparkling void? Each religion comes with its own images of God. They may inspire love, fear, guilt, or doubt. In Eastern traditions, they are often objects of contemplation, evoking spiritual qualities in the aspirant. Carl Jung explored the God image in myth and in the psyches of his patients. For me, this God image is the hidden object of desire, hidden in the unconscious shadow, but pointing towards something beyond ego and arousing our holy longing. When we find a sacred teacher or spiritual guide who evokes that longing, our image of God leaps out of our inner world and onto an idealized human being. And we're filled with exalted feelings of devotion in the presence of our ideal. In our psyches, the teacher has realized in human form the ideal other living within the student, the image of the complete or self-realized human being. And so within the inner world of the student, the teacher carries the student's own highest authority, the parent who won't fail him, the godlike human whose attributes she strives to emulate. For the student to recognize the teacher as such, there must be a match between the inner image and the outer person. The arrow of projection hits the target, and the student feels a fit, an inward yes. Jung called this an archetypal projection, distinct from a personal parental projection. He uncovered through a patient's dream that this patient was turning him into a god. And like that patient, we're unconsciously attributing godlike status to spiritual teachers. Once activated, this projection holds a promise and a duty, an inspiration and a burden. On the flip side, the teacher basks in the admiration and devotion of the student. He may feel enlarged in her gaze. And in some cases, teachers unconsciously come to emotionally depend on this adoration, like food. And so they behave in ways that exact obedience from their followers. With a lack of moral development, they may act out their shadows in destructive ways. What would lead us as independent, developed adults to endow another human being with so much power and authority that we feel blind faith? Our tender longings activate vulnerable feelings of childlike devotion. As Freud pointed out, each of us carries unmet childhood needs into adulthood, like an unconscious longing to merge with a powerful figure for protection against frightening feelings of powerlessness. And so we're susceptible to the vagaries of human authority. Freudians believe only in the influence of our personal histories. And so for them, our longing for an almighty other refers only to a parent, and religion is a replay of childhood. But Carl Jung pointed out that archetypal projection, the attribution of a divine figure, is hidden beneath and behind the parental projection. So let's step back and be sure that we're on the same page about the meaning of projection. When two people meet and feel a deep connection, their hearts open, and so do their imaginations. Through projection, the shadow expels both positive and negative content, as Jim called it, by attributing them to other people and disowning that in ourselves. Each of us carries a kind of archer's quiver on our backs, and every so often an arrow shoots out unpredictably. Oh, that person is stupid, or that person is wise and compassionate. We may say something nasty, or we may fall in love. So in our discussion here, we can begin to surrender at that moment to an idealized teacher and our early needs to feel special, to be seen, to keep secrets, to feel belonging are all at play. But neither the teacher nor the student is aware of this dynamic. Some of us unknowingly seek teachers like our parents, and others seek those who are different. But in the unconscious, the shadow has its own agenda. People meet teachers who seem at a conscious level to be different from their parents. But later, when the shadow erupts, they discover that he or she is a lot like a parent. For instance, a teacher may appear to be gentle and compassionate, but when he's angry, he becomes a critical know-it-all, just like a woman's father. Or when he begins to gain wealth, he becomes a materialistic consumer, just like a follower's family. Or when his sexuality isn't processed, he may begin to seduce women with promises of salvation or enlightenment, urging her to keep the secret, just like family secrets. It's an unconscious match, The shadow in each of them is unconsciously recreating a parent-child relationship, bringing an opportunity for spiritual shadow work to expand our awareness to these hidden parts of ourselves. And what happens when the projection rattles? Did you experience spiritual or religious abuse of power, sexual coercion, financial coercion? Was it covert abuse or overt abuse? Let's take a few minutes and explore each of these. So our clergy and spiritual teachers, even when awake in advanced stages of consciousness, are still human and are not perfect. If a teacher's ego becomes inflated with success, surrounded by adoring followers and the props of a lineage, he or she may come to feel the right to sit on a golden throne and increase authority without limits. Using power to serve the ego's agenda, the danger grows, and soon he doesn't have power. Power has him. And it becomes an unconscious complex, acted out on the stage of the most sacred arena of life. Teachers or clergy may subject their followers to verbal abuse, physical violence, emotional control, withholding of approval, threats of punishment and expulsion. What's taking place in the psychology of the teacher and the student at this time? Power and sex go hand in hand. An incursion may be careless or aggressive, subtle or traumatic. But many clergy and teachers use sex to express power, intimidate others, and feel their own emptiness. In particular, a culture's deeply ingrained traditions of misogyny and objectification can engender in male teachers a shadow that allows them to use women, men, girls, or boys as objects for their own gratification. The high-profile cases of the Me Too movement reposed questions about power and gender. Who has the power and who doesn't? Who has consent? Can someone consent if her career, education, mental health, financial well-being, or spiritual well-being is controlled by the person who desires sex? Can she consent if she's told that she'll be excommunicated, her family will go to hell, her karma will be damaged for lifetimes if she refuses? The power differential between religious clergy and their acolytes make consent questionable. And this is a key insight for teachers who feel attraction to students and believe they can act with impunity. Like sex, money can become the ego's tool. It's the root of all evil, and it's the grail we seek. And it carries the projection of divine energies and can be worshipped like a false god in the form of a sleek private jet, a shiny Rolls Royce, a golden throne. And financial coercion can be covert, beginning with tithing, and lead to overt abuse, such as when a teacher demands access to a student's income or inheritance. The reports of so many teachers living lifestyles of excess, in contrast to their teachings, and in contrast to those who serve them, are deeply disheartening. When examined together, the incidents of spiritual abuse reveal patterns across denominations. I'm going to just read this quickly so we can move forward. So a priest or teacher exploits others for his or her narcissistic needs. A teacher's transgressions are often boundary violations. The member chosen for abuse is made to feel special. Others enable the abusive behavior. Members deny their own feelings, doubts, and intuitions. They seek to maintain the projection. They rationalize hurtful behavior. Secrets glue the system together. Members are threatened by the teacher with retaliation for disclosure or for wishing to leave. At some point, a student or believer can no longer tolerate being the subject of shaming or sexual violence. Or she can no longer tolerate being a witness to hypocrisy or coercion. These moments of choice come and go as a student calculates her risks of staying, her risks of leaving. And it's a tense, painful period for many people, filled with fear, confusion, guilt, and loss. For any member of a church, synagogue, satsang, sangha, or zendo. If she can break through denial and begin self-reflection, here are some questions to start the journey. Reflect on your role as a student, believer in relation to the teacher. Were you obedient, dependent, and repeating family patterns? What did you project, and what did you repress into your shadow? Can you feel the tension between your devotion and your growing need for autonomy and self-expression? Have you given away your spiritual essence and projected your spiritual authority, your light, onto the teacher? Have you accepted a teacher's definitions of spirituality and moral behavior? Have you projected your certainty and banished your doubts to be with a teacher or a set of teachings? What do you need in order to reclaim your critical thinking? Have you cultivated a spiritual persona that narrows your range of feeling? For example, banishing grief or anger or sexuality into the shadow. And what's your biggest fear of reclaiming these feelings? What do you need to feel safe to reclaim your feelings? Do you believe the impulses of the body are dangerous temptations? Which bodily sensations have you forbidden? And what would happen if you allowed them to arise? What do you need for that to feel safe? Have you become submissive, passive, giving up action in your own behalf? Are you unable to feel or express doubt or questions? What do you need to act on your own behalf and reclaim your agency? What do you need to separate from an abusive relationship or community? So a fortunate few of us find the narrow path through the darkness and undergo an initiation. We travel from spiritual innocence through the dark descent toward a new level of consciousness, spiritual maturity. We evolve from dependency on a spiritual parent through meeting the shadow towards spiritual adulthood. And having been emptied out of old ideas and images, we become fertile soil for new life. Open but not naive, eager but not impatient, ripe for blossoming. And with practice, we learn to meet the darkness in ourselves and in our teachers, gradually coming to accept it as part of being human, but no longer susceptible to its abuse. We may now be able to see some of our own shadows, accept our limitations, and empathize more deeply. For some people, this inner work requires separation from a teacher and community. For others, it requires becoming a whistleblower, but staying to reimagine and redesign the group. It requires that we reclaim all that was sacrificed onto an idealized teacher because our capacity to carry our own greatness was diminished, and it's now expanded to contain it. And as we carry our own light, settled in being or pure consciousness or vast awareness, we begin to witness our thinking and no longer identify with it. We begin to witness our feeling and no longer identify with it. We begin to witness the body and no longer identify with it. And we begin to release agency and experience the flow of life through us. That's the nature of awakening. I'm calling for a reimagination of religious and spiritual life that expands to include the human shadow. It's not absent in anyone. It's not going anywhere. It's part of the path and of the human journey. But it's not the whole story. The human soul's longing for transcendence, awakening, the higher self, is a central mystery of a human life. And for some, it's purpose. To follow our holy longing, we must ask, what is spiritual integrity? To me, it means living with the awareness of our interdependence with all life. If we don't have the direct experience of that interconnection, we can hold the knowledge of it and act accordingly. This includes inner work on our moral development, which is neglected in many spiritual traditions. It includes speaking and behaving with honesty and transparency, not secrecy. It includes living with congruence. We do what we say, not hypocrisy. It includes shadow awareness, taking responsibility when our shadows act out. And this then is the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening. I want to close by offering an invitation to everyone who's interested in reading the book and doing spiritual shadow work with community support. I will be forming free, leaderless online groups with the intention to read the book together and do the practices in community. So if you'd like that, if that's appealing to you, please shoot me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com. Put spiritual shadow work in the subject line and be sure to include your time zone. Please don't send me a long story because I just get too many emails. But when I get your request and your time zone, I will connect you with others in the same time zone and help you to form a group to go through the work together. Thank you. I'm eager to talk to Jim about all this.
Thank you, Connie. Splendid overview of this shadow of the spiritual path, and lots of comments in the chats. And why don't we start with whether you would differentiate? You've written, meeting the shadow, romancing the shadow, the shadow of aging. You touched on that in the inner life of age, and now shadow on the spiritual path. As you've experienced it and understand it, is the shadow just shadow wherever it is, and there's no real kind of qualitative distinctions, or does the shadow show up in different ways, say in personal relations or in politics or in on the spiritual path? What's your understanding of that?
So, the shadow is infinite, just like the light. So when we meet the shadow in a particular way, whatever the context is, if it's that we are repeatedly criticizing our partner whom we love, and we don't know why that keeps coming up, or we have the same repetitive fight with a partner, or we meet the shadow of a teacher, or we find ourselves struggling with an addiction, a compulsive behavior, we can't stop eating or drinking, or we are struggling with depression, or we notice that we are always projecting the same thing, let's say judgment, onto someone. All of these different shadow contents come out in different contexts, right? But each of them is just a teeny tiny part of the unconscious. So the personal unconscious in each of us, in our body mind, lodged in our body minds, is kind of embedded in our family shadow, which is embedded in our community shadow, which is embedded in our national and our global shadows. So there are these kind of interconnectedness of the personal and collective unconscious that's constantly influencing these experiences that we have of meeting our shadows. So we could look at some aspect of our own shadow, and in my model, which I explored in Romancing the Shadow, that was where I introduced the method of shadow work. What we do is we learn how to detect the repeating pattern, let's say, of the critic. And when the critic erupts in us, it's kind of amazing when I discovered this, Jim. Every time the critic erupts, regardless of the context, we say the same thing to ourselves. And with the same feeling arises and the same bodily sensations arises. And we learn how to form those three cues into an inner figure. And we give it a name and we give it an image. Let's say we call it the critic. So the next time we start to criticize, our husband's hair or whatever it is, we recognize that pattern. And we recognize that it's in us. It's not in him or her. And that we're in a projection, a shadow projection of the critic. And we breathe and we witness that. And we try to understand with shadow work why that's emerging in that moment. I found with clients that often when there was a repeating fight with a partner, there was a valid need that was hidden inside of that criticism. And the need was for distance. We were making distance, or that person was making distance unknowingly, unconsciously, unintentionally through the criticism. But what she really needed to say was, I need some space. I'm taking the day to myself today. Instead of hurting the other person to make distance. So often there's a repeating, right? So often there's the same pattern in every shadow character. Like every time the addict comes up, it's the same inner dialogue, the same feelings and the same sensations in the body. And that's how you can recognize it. Or the abandoned child, or the in the case of the new book, you know, the idealization of the teacher and the projection of the light. Wow, he's so evolved. I want to be like that. She's so compassionate. I'm not like that. I want to be like that. And so there's this repeating projection of the darkness or of the light, and we can begin to identify it by those 3 cues and work with it. Now, as I said, this is just a tiny bit of material, right? Compared to this collective shadow that's becoming more and more visible to us today. The collective shadow, you know, around war. We couldn't have enemy making in war if we didn't do shadow projection. Wouldn't be happening. We wouldn't have this political divisiveness among the tribes now in America if we weren't doing shadow projection. But in our own inner work, there is this contribution we can make by shedding light on these small aspects of our own darkness and beginning to bring them into awareness. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense that the shadow is really the shadow, and it's omnipresent, but it's also incredibly diverse in the way that it can manifest. So it can manifest in, you know, Nazi Germany and Trump's America. It can manifest in a marriage or a social relationship, even with your pets. Your shadow content, your irritability can be triggered and surfaced and shot out. And
there are cultural differences. Some cultures say, you know, XYZ is acceptable, and in other cultures it's taboo. So there are group differences. You know, a fundamentalist Christian community will say something is forbidden, and, you know, a liberal whatever community will say it's fine. So there are cultural differences as well.
Yeah. You know, and one thinks of the 60s, you know, and as someone who went through it, I think we were persuaded that we had passed in casting off traditional America and the religious conservatism. I think a whole generation thought they had also cast out their shadow and became more susceptible to the shadow because they thought they had conquered it, or that it wasn't relevant because they were meditating every day and doing practice and eating vegetarian food, so that they thought that the practices of enlightenment would protect them from shadow content. And it didn't work out. I mean, it was a disastrous experience, I think, for many. And I think one of the reasons why we had so much shadow content with all the gurus. I mean, what would be your sense of that? Because you came out of the 60s.
Yeah, I was at Berkeley in the late 60s. And when I look at it now, I think that in some ways I was projecting a lot of my own shadow content onto mainstream culture.
Mm-hmm.
And making it all bad. You know, the war in Vietnam, the Black Power movement, the military industrial complex. If we look at all that languaging now, we can see shadow projection in it. But that doesn't mean that it was all good and we were just projecting. Because, right? Yeah. It's much more nuanced than that. It's not a black and white conversation. And the same thing in the spiritual domain. I want to say to people, you know, if anyone was upset by this presentation, your teacher and your community can have great value. Your teacher can be transmitting compassion and wisdom, and at the same time be acting out shadow. So this is not an all good, all bad situation. Right. It's really complex, and it takes discernment, a lot of discernment, to figure out how to respond if you experience spiritual abuse or you witness it. It takes a lot of discernment to figure out when you're entering a community and you see red flags, whether that's enough to stop you and really make you question, or whether you can see enough value that, you know, those red flags don't stop you. My advice would be, though, if you see them, don't go into denial, right? Don't pretend they're not there. Hold your awareness, hold shadow awareness, continue to gain value. And if something worsens, ask yourself again. Like I interviewed a lot of people for this book, and one woman said to me, I knew in my body that he was dangerous, but I ignored it.
Mm.
My body told me there was danger, but it was so glorious and beautiful, and so I ignored it. So there are these warnings in us that if we allow them to rise to awareness, they allow us to discern whether it's safe, whether it's a positive situation or not for us.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that particular strand for a moment, because I think all of us have had experiences either directly or vicariously with a range of gurus, that have flowed through, whether it was Trungpa and Naropa or Bhagwan and Puna and Muktananda and Maharishi. All of them ended up with feet of clay, and the purity that we all sought in them was bitterly dissipated away. And I never, became a sannyasin, but I really tracked Bhagwan and his rise and his fall. And I can still remember the time when in Pune where he paraded, I think it was 100 Rolls Royces. And what was kind of shocking to me was the devotional adulation that he was receiving from his devotees. They thought this was an extraordinary act of humor and kind of spiritual exuberance, and none were aware of the way that the whole situation was being manipulated, and that wealth consciousness was seizing Bhagwan's psyche, which seemed clear to me at the time. But I was just struck by the denial on the part of the sannyasins for something that was so glaringly obvious if you weren't a sannyasin. So talk about, there may be another guru that you would like to talk about. I just picked out Bhagwan, but we've also got, recent events around the Dalai Lama. If there is anybody that I thought was way beyond all that, and there was no indication that I'd ever heard, and then all of a sudden, this episode with this young boy, and I don't fully understand it because it came as such a shock to me, given the way I was, I guess, projecting onto the Dalai Lama. But talk about that for a bit, because it's a very, very complex phenomenon.
So, if for anybody who's interested in Bhagwan, Rajneesh, or Osho, there's an incredible documentary. It was on Netflix. I don't know if it still is, called Wild Wild Country.
Yes, I
it's
saw
really
it.
worth watching, because you can tell both the value that people are getting, the joy and the love in the community, as well as how it begins to degenerate, how paranoia starts to come about. Some of his closest staff begin to kind of decompensate and get strange, how he begins to use drugs and become more paranoid and bring guns into the compound. And it's a deeply psychological film about really what I'm trying to write about and teach about now. And it's not unusual, unfortunately. And I want to also say, Jim, mainstream religion, the same principles apply. So if you're not interested in Eastern teachers, you can look at your priest or your minister or your rabbi.
Oh, yes.
With the same principles that we're talking about, right? So my sense is that, well, let's take a breath with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama's staff, after this video went viral with him and a young boy, he was hugging a young boy, and he asked him to stick out his tongue in his mouth. And this went viral. And so they sent out a video explanation that this is a culturally accepted kind of rite of passage, or I'm not sure if it was a greeting or exactly what it is, but that in Tibet, this is something that happens all the time between the monks and their followers. So I don't know the reality of that, but what we know is culturally, it was really abrasive and shocking for us because it's not a part of postmodern Western culture that that's acceptable to us. And I think that for me, when I was researching the book and found that some Tibetan teachers and survivors of sexual assault in Tibetan communities went to the Dalai Lama with a document to complain about this. For me, his response was more shocking than this event with the little boy. His response was, "Oh, I know about all this. I've known for years." So what does that tell us? It tells us that the Dalai Lama is a world teacher of profound gifts, profound integrity, profound compassion. He has really, in so many ways, saved the people of Tibet, from the aggression of China. So let's not dismiss that, right? As we talk about his denial of the abuse. So if he had tried to act, my presumption, and this is pure speculation, is that if he had tried to act on like Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche or Sogyal Rinpoche or Norla Rinpoche, all these Tibetan teachers who had really serious allegations of abuse, what would have happened? The whole reputation of Tibetan Buddhism, the institutions and the teachers in the West would have been really sullied, would have been really in trouble. And he chose to uphold that over individual transgressions. That's kind of the only understanding I've been able to come to. He did go and stand with some of these teachers like Sogyal Rinpoche after the abuse allegations, which is implicitly showing implicit support of them. So it wasn't just that he ignored it, he actually showed up and did that. So he was in some way colluding, right, or complicit from my point of view. At the same time, it's understandable that he didn't want this empire that has been transplanted to the West to be attacked and destroyed. So these situations are complex. Many of them are really complex, and we don't want to lose the light side while we explore the dark side, but we don't want to dismiss the dark side, because the light side is so bright, like with the Dalai Lama. And I'm trying to hold the complexity and the opposites here in this exploration.
Yeah. And there's, interesting discussion in the chat, some people are pointing out that, asking someone to stick out their tongue is a Tibetan idiom. I think you're right that that's hugely complex. And, as Marie France Lepage is saying also in the chat, that, the Tibetan Buddhist culture was systematically patriarchal and misogynistic to its core, and as was the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. And
That's right.
so you have this extraordinary phenomenon of the liberation of women, 2,000 years later, but the momentum of the patriarchy, the momentum of coercive control is so strong that it lives on both consciously and unconsciously in the institutional structures, because Pope Francis, for like the Dalai Lama, an extraordinary human being, has, overlooked and protected the pedophiles in his own church and awarded huge bishoprics to, disgraced cardinals and so forth and so on. And it's part of the complexity of the overall individual, but also the political and social context of the institution itself. Anytime you come into leadership, you have to pick your battles. And dealing with the patriarchy is probably the biggest battle of them all, and it has to be approached rather gingerly, I would imagine. And yet I just felt so sad. It was the first time I'd heard anything about the Dalai Lama that would in any way have indicated, at least to me, that he wasn't, a fully enlightened being and worthy of deep universal respect, especially after everything that he did. So I continue to give him the benefit of the doubt, but there's now doubt.
Yes, I hear you. You're holding both sides, and it's really valuable. It's valuable to do that because we're seeing his humanity. We're seeing his humanity now. Someone, Kurt, in the chat is writing about Muktananda.
Yeah, another one.
People gained tremendous value from Shaktipat with Muktananda. I have a number of friends who've been in that community for many decades and continue to do the practices. And, Muktananda was found to be sleeping with teenage girls at the end of his life. There's pretty much no doubt about it. I mean, there's a lot of substantiation. There was a big article in the New Yorker about it, and then about his Guru Mai, the woman he handed the empire to, and her terrible abuses. And so there is this lineage of practice and wisdom, and right alongside of it, this acting out the shadow in very destructive ways. And it's very difficult for people to make choices about that. I have a very close friend who was involved with Vishwananda, who's a young guy from India, who teaches in Europe. And it came out that he was having sex with his male students who were heterosexual, didn't really want to be doing it. And she was in a terrible dilemma what to do, because she was having fantastic spiritual experiences, and yet she discovered this about her teacher. So what do you do in this situation? How do you choose? And I'm not telling people what to do. That's not my position here. What I'm suggesting is allow yourself to really be open to the truth, the whole enchilada that's happening, and make your choices consciously, what's best for you, like Kurt is describing in the chat, how he made his choice. And we don't know what unfolds if we leave a community. So in my own case, I started transcendental meditation when I was 19. not for any holy reason, but because I wanted to date a guy who wouldn't go out with me if I didn't do TM, right? This is in Berkeley. I was 19.
No great act was ever done with a single motive.
Right. And I started meditating and I loved it. And my anger dissipated and I felt really good about it. And I went off and became a TM teacher. And at that time, I was with Maharishi for several months. He was still available. And there were no rumors about him then. But what started happening over the next few years was that the organization became more and more authoritarian and more hierarchical. And people began to tell lies in order to get new practices. And I began to become increasingly uncomfortable. By then there were rumors that he was telling people to be celibate, but he was having sex with women students. So I left and it was excruciating. I lost all my friends. No one would speak to me after that. I didn't have a career. My family had been alienated by my choice to be doing that for a decade. And I came back, very alone and despondent. But what happened, Jim? I read The Aquarian Conspiracy. Do you remember that book?
I do.
By Marilyn Ferguson.
Marilyn Ferguson, yes.
1981. I picked up the phone just to say, wow, Marilyn, this book is fantastic. And when she answered the phone, she said, come in. I need an editor. I'm going to teach you how to write. And she became my writing mentor, and my life went off in a different direction.
Wow.
So I'm telling that because you don't know what will come of these transitions.
Yeah.
You can go through this very painful, challenging meeting the shadow, and you don't know what will come out the other side of it and how your life will change and how the flow of your dharma or your life story will unfold. So I'm just suggesting that if you feel that you are in an abusive situation, we have 100 people listening to us now. If any of you feel that, please read the book. I hope it will offer you guidance. That's really my intention. If you want group support, you can email me, conniezweig@gmail.com, and we'll connect you with other people. If you are simply interested in this, or if you are a clinician, a professional clinician who's working with people who are struggling with this in a church or a synagogue, again, it doesn't have to be Eastern teachers, but it can be, then let us know. My real intention here is to offer support and guidance for people. Yeah.
Well, as we bring this to a close, that's the way I wanted to focus your attention is if one is in a situation that one intuitively or somatically feels is unsavory, just remind us again. I know you went through it in your PowerPoint, but just remind us again the what to look for in the spiritual path to discern the shadow, particularly in a guru or a master or a rabbi or a priest. How do we protect ourselves? And if we're in those situations, how do we get ourselves out?
Well, there's a section called Moving from Bystander to Whistleblower. Because this is now in the context of Me Too. I mean, we have a cultural context for this now that supports reporting in a way that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. So shadow awareness internally, Jim, what are you saying to yourself? Can you turn within and really allow yourself to notice the doubt, to notice the questions, to notice that your habit is to shut them down. Your habit is to push them under. But what if you allow them up, just even for a moment? What are you saying to yourself? And what are the feelings that come up with that? Are the feelings fear, anxiety, gratitude, contentment? What is going on in your body with those thoughts and feelings? Where is there tightness? Where is there relaxation? What happens if you take a few breaths and you let everything relax? Then what is your inner dialogue telling you? So if you want to do shadow work, you can take those 3 cues and form them into a character. What is that character saying, feeling, and sensing? Let's call it the doubter, just for the sake of it here. And then you get to know the doubter, like doubting Thomas, right? What is that doubter? What is the hidden value that the doubter is bringing to you? What is the deeper need of the doubter? Remember, Cassandra in Greek myth is the one who spoke the truth and she was never heard. She was never listened to. Is this like a Cassandra figure who's being ignored, but really carrying the truth?
And remember, Cassandra was cursed with that because she wouldn't sleep with Apollo.
Oh, I had forgotten that. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
She
Okay.
rejected his sexual advances, and therefore he cursed her.
Okay.
Knowing the truth, but nobody would believe her.
Okay. So let's take
Perfect
that
example.
outside. So let's look outside to the Apollo figure here. So what is the teacher asking of you? What is the teacher, how is the teacher treating people? Is there respect? Is there support? Look at it in terms of power, in terms of sex, and in terms of money.
Yeah.
Are you giving away a lot of money? Are you working for free? So many people doing seva. What is your motivation for doing service or seva? Really look, really check in with yourself. What is your motivation there? What are you really wanting in return? Even though seva is about not wanting something in return. What are you secretly wanting in return? Are you being asked to hold secrets about the community? If so, are you repeating family patterns? You know, there's a whole section about alcoholic families and how often in these communities, the patterns of alcoholic families are repeated. So is your family of origin being repeated here in your spiritual family? Or are you feeling more free and more autonomous and growing in your self-expression? Because that's possible too. Are those qualities being supported? So really take the time for self-examination and examination of your clergy person and community, and look at how are other people responding. Do they look like they're growing in awareness or happiness, or do they look like they're growing in subservience and depression? There's a lot of depression in these communities. People feel helpless.
Yeah. Well, Tricia Fortina is bringing in a related subject that I think is worth commenting on in terms of the phenomenon of the collective shadow as activated by demagogues like Trump. Because there's a lot of similarities between that and spiritual shadow. It's just political shadow.
Yes.
Although with political shadow, it tends not to be covert as much as a very overt animation of shadow contents in the culture that the culture previously has had the good sense to repress. So that's another important aspect. Sometimes repression is good. because
Yes, it's
as Jung said,
necessary. We'll
yeah,
call
yeah,
it
yeah,
necessary, individually and collectively. Yes.
that's exactly right. That's
But,
exactly right.
I would say the projection onto Trump has a religious component to it. It's
Hmm.
not only political, it really has a savior dimension to it, and a fate dimension to it. Because a lot of people carrying this projection can't see any other alternative. We
Exactly.
can't imagine that isn't still president now and won't be president again, and that he carries a certain inevitability around him, that he carries a certain divine, it's almost divine projection for some people in that tribe. And at the same time, when he first said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his followers wouldn't care, that is turning out to be true.
Yeah, yeah.
So what is the entrenchment of this denial about? Because it's a very similar dynamic to the denial in religious communities. He is acting out with impunity. And no matter what the news anchors say or the reports tell us, those folks don't care. And the same thing is going on in spiritual communities. People know there's harm being done, and they still can't act on it. So yes, someone is saying Bolsonaro, same. So what happened? Yes, Trump is called the second coming. So let's pause here for a minute. So what is going on here? So I spoke about our unmet childhood needs in our projections onto leaders, whether they're secular or spiritual. What is it that we need if we are worshiping Trump in this way? We need to be right, because if we're wrong, if he's bad or he loses, then we're fools, right? We are fools. We've been duped. And so part of the clinging to that projection is about our own self-image. It's also about our own beliefs. If what we believe is wrong, there's a shame that comes up around that. It's also about belonging. In the chakra system, the third chakra is about tribal identification. So when you see all these people in their red hats and their red sweatshirts, they look like a tribe. And my husband often says their tribal consciousness, they're identifying with the group and feeling this tremendous, powerful sense of belonging with a leader. So if we look at the history of cults around the world, right, there's that same sense of Jamestown. He got those people out of the country. He got them, believing they should commit suicide. So there's this profound sense of belonging and purpose and mission that comes out of joining together with others who are kind of worshiping the same leader. So there are a lot of different needs in here. And there's also a sense of attributing our own individual uncertainty. So if you're willing to live with uncertainty, you are a courageous person. But if you believe everything someone else says and merge with their beliefs so that you have certainty, then you're kind of glued to that person. But you feel safe. You don't have to figure it out for yourself. If Trump has all the answers or your guru has all the answers, you don't have to live in uncertainty and figure it out for yourself, which is a scary part of adulthood. And the one last thing I'll say is, Jim, in our culture, our cultural persona is about the hero's journey. the independent, autonomous adult, right? Building an IT company or building a family or whatever it is on your own, by your bootstraps. What's in the shadow of that cultural persona? Dependency, needing people. And so part of what happens in these relationships is the dependency comes out of the shadow. The certainty, the uncertainty comes out of the shadow. All these childhood needs for belonging come out of the shadow. And we're bonded to that person as if he's a savior, as if he alone can bring enlightenment, or he alone can bring salvation, or he alone can make America great again.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And you think of the contagion,
yes,
that the demagogue can also cause. So there's not only, and we're going to have that tested tomorrow when he appears in federal court in Florida. He's put the call out very explicitly, as has the Republican Party, that the people should be standing up. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how many of his followers around the United States, as they did in January 6th activities, etc., how many of them are going to stay with him and act in a radical, potentially violent way around his arraignment tomorrow morning in federal court in Florida, because he's seeking to mobilize that group of people to his aid. So I think there's going to be a lot of close press attention to see how many people actually show up and what they actually do.
Yeah, I wish there were more psychological commentary on all this,
Yeah.
I really wish, because I really think he's showing sociopathy to the world.
Oh, yeah.
He's demonstrating sociopathy, and there's so much to learn from that. In the same way that some of these teachers are sociopaths, I'm convinced. Some of the stories in the book, I initially thought that it was narcissism, but you can't be this destructive of other people if you have any conscience at all. And I think that that's what Trump is modeling for us now. And it should be, it needs to be stated that way as a really serious warning that not only the behavior is horrific, but that this psychology, needs to be understood in child rearing and families and organizations and so forth. He's modeling that.
Because unchecked, whether it's the guru or Trump or whoever, it becomes increasingly destructive.
Yeah, because of the contagion that you mentioned. Yeah.
It's such extraordinary things. Well, Connie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For a lifetime. You've spent a lifetime studying the shadow. I mean, I don't know of anybody out there that has spent more time at more levels of shadow, just studying it in a therapeutic way to enable people to free themselves of it. So
thank you for what you're doing every day. Is just crucial that you're presenting, Jim. I love it.
Well, we want to have people like you, so that, because our position is with yours, that the more we know and the more we're in a spirit of inquiry, the more we can hold contradictions, the more we can just think critically, but in a positive way of self-empowerment.
Yes.
The more fortitude we will have to navigate an increasingly turbulent world. So
yes, the more
you're part of Humanity Rising. You're part of us.
And I'm part of you, and you're part of me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, everyone. That'll bring our session to a close. This has been marvelous on the shadow. We'll have Connie back in due course on more commentary on these matters. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. And we hope to see you again tomorrow. And tomorrow I'm going to take the session, and we're going to have a deeper dive into playing with fire and really understanding the indigenous and Aboriginal views on technology. That'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone.
So
Thank you.
Jim, I don't see the after chat link. Stan, will you post it again, please?
Right there.
I'd like to come.
You see it?
That's it.
Right there. It's also in the email that Katie sent you with the link.
Okay, great. All right, I'll go there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.